I didn't sit down at the table so much as lower myself into it, the way you do when you already know where the weight of the room will land. The dining room looked the same as it always had: polished wood, linen napkins folded into something my mother learned decades ago and never revised. Even the air felt practiced, like it knew the sequence. My son slid into the chair beside me, careful not to bump anyone. He had learned that, too. His feet didn't reach the floor. He hooked his ankles around the chair rung and looked around with the kind of alertness children develop when they're trying to read rules no one explains out loud. My sister arrived last, as usual, apologetic but smiling, bearing a bottle of wine and a story about traffic that no one really listened to. My father stood to greet her anyway. He always did. The movement was subtle, but it registered. It always had. Dinner unfolded with the predictable beats: weather, work, a neighbor's renovation. I spoke when spoken to. My sister held court without seeming to try. She had that ease. Or maybe it was permission. When the plates were cleared, my father leaned back, glass in hand, eyes warm, in that way that meant he was about to say something he considered generous. You know, he said, nodding toward my sister, your sister gave me everything I ever wanted. He paused. The room leaned in. She gave this family a real legacy. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't sharp. That was the problem. It landed like a conclusion everyone else had already reached. I felt my son shift beside me. His shoulders dropped, not dramatically, just enough to be noticeable if you were looking. He leaned toward me, his voice so quiet it barely disturbed the space between us. So I'm not part of it. The question wasn't accusing, it was logistical, like he was checking the rules of a game halfway through. I didn't answer him right away. I couldn't, because answering meant choosing between correcting a child gently and correcting a room decisively. And I had spent most of my life choosing the first and avoiding the second. No one else spoke. No one rushed to clarify. My sister stared at her plate. My father took a sip of wine, satisfied, as if he'd finally articulated something that had been true all along. In that silence, I understood something with uncomfortable clarity. This wasn't just about me anymore. It never had been, really, but now it had crossed a line I could no longer pretend wasn't there. Favoritism is survivable when it's abstract. When it lives in tone, in invitations extended unevenly, in praise that always seems to land one seat over. You learn to compensate. You tell yourself stories about resilience, about independence. You build a private dignity out of lowered expectations. But when it reaches a child, when it teaches them, wordlessly, that belonging is conditional, you either interrupt it or become part of the lesson. I felt my hand close around my glass before I decided to do anything with it. The movement surprised me. I stood because my body had already committed. I'd like to make a toast, I said. The words sounded steadier than I felt. That surprised me too. Everyone looked up. This was unusual enough to earn attention. I want to thank you, I continued, looking at my father, then my sister, then the rest of the table, for being so clear tonight. Clarity is a gift, even when it's uncomfortable. My sister's brow furrowed slightly. My father smiled, indulgent, as if I were about to offer something heartfelt and harmless. I've been thinking a lot about legacy, I said. About what we pass down, and to whom. I took a breath. I hadn't rehearsed this. But the facts were there, lined up waiting. As some of you know, I went on, finalized my estate plans last month. Guardianship, education funds, everything. I also accepted the board position I was offered at the foundation downtown. It comes with decision-making authority over several family grants, including the one Grandpa started. The room changed. Not loudly, but unmistakably. I did that, I said, because I want my son to grow up knowing exactly where he stands. Not because he's favored, not because he's overlooked, but because he's protected. I looked down at him then. He was watching me closely, eyes wide, trying to understand what kind of moment this was. So, I said, lifting my glass a little higher, here's to legacy. Not the kind that's inherited by accident. The kind that's chosen, built, and very clearly accounted for. I didn't smile. I didn't glare. I drank. No one clapped. My father set his glass down slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. Authority, when it shows up uninvited, has a way of rearranging priorities without asking permission. My sister finally met my eyes. There was no anger there. Just recognition. She had always known where the lines were drawn. She had just assumed they wouldn't move. Dinner ended shortly after. polite goodbyes, tight hugs, promises to talk later that might or might not be kept. In the car, my son was quiet for a long time. Streetlights passed over his face in steady intervals. Am I really part of it? He asked finally. I didn't give him a speech. I didn't need to. You are, I said. And if anyone ever forgets that, it's my job to remind them. He nodded, satisfied, not triumphant. Just steadier. I drove home with a strange calm settling in my chest. I knew there would be consequences. Distance, awkward holidays, a subtle reclassification of me within the family story. But for the first time, I felt aligned with the version of myself I wanted my son to learn from. Legacy, I realized, isn't what you're praised for at the table. It's what you refuse to let be taken in silence.